Hi, this is Melissa Goman with the National Juvenile Justice Network. Just wanted to welcome everybody to the webinar today. So we're going to get started. For those of you who aren't as familiar with the National Juvenile Justice Network, we lead a national movement of state-based juvenile justice coalitions and organizations, as well as alumni of our Youth Justice Leadership Institute. And we currently have 53 organizational members in 43 states. What's up? So today we're going to be talking about gang databases, and just wanted to point you to a couple of NJJN's publications. I have added one of them to our resources list, which you should be able to find. That's the Safeguarding Confidentiality of Youth in the Justice System. And this was part of a policy platform we did a couple of years ago, and it has some recommendations regarding gang databases. And then more recently, we just published our gang research and talking points. This is a document for members. So to get this document, you just need to go to our website and log in. If you have any trouble, please feel free to let me know. I'd be happy to send it to you. And this publication provides both research on gang issues as well as talking points for addressing and countering some of the messages that are promoting fear against youth of color and gangs. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our speaker today, Kim McGill. Kim has been the longtime organizer with the Youth Justice Coalition in California, and has done a lot of work on gang databases and a lot of the problems that they've had in California with these that are being unfortunately replicated in many states across the country. So they've had a lot of success recently with fighting back against some of the larger problems with gang databases and injunctions, which she will talk about with us today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Kim.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate NJJN giving us this opportunity, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country, to all the NJJN family out there. As was said, my name is Kim, and I'm at the Youth Justice Coalition. And since our start, we've been challenging the war on gangs as a war on youth of color, and been trying to dismantle gang databases and gang injunctions, as well as gang enhancements, which are kind of the third leg of the war on gang strategy that law enforcement uses. And then more recently, really pushing back on the crimmigration, the use of gang labeling to impact people's ability to stay in the country or come to the country. So this presentation looks a little bit at the history. These policies came out of Los Angeles, but have spread quickly throughout the state, the nation, and now the world. But we want to take special responsibility for the fact that these policies came out of LA. And I think that's part of the reason why we're so intent on dismantling them, as well as on talking to everybody else who are getting these policies much later than us about what we've learned and also about how to challenge them. If we start, I'm going to try to move the screen. The slides. Can everybody see the slides? Hopefully everyone's being able to see them. Okay, there we go. So the first thing is that obviously people know this because you do the work all the time, but the criminalization of young people and adults too with gang labels does not require them to be involved in any gang or criminal activity. In fact, the majority of people are swept into gang databases or even onto gang injunctions without having been arrested or convicted of any gang-related issues, or even in most cases, any issues at all. And it's that larger impact of criminalization on not only the people that are labeled, but also the entire communities that we're especially concerned about. Entire communities is seen as people that need more policing, are quote-unquote dangerous, are not communities that should be allowed into other spaces. So gang injunctions and gang databases have been used a lot as a tool of gentrification and displacement. And so the need for a clear definition for us for criminalization was really essential in beginning the work. The other thing that we did is that when we first started, we started to recognize how people were talking about gangs, and especially how elected officials and law enforcement were talking about them. And what was commonly said, this was when we first started, it was 2003. So what was commonly said by the mid 2000s, but had been said for decades prior, was that by then there were 100,000 quote unquote gang members in LA County, that there were 700 gangs and over 50,000 members in LA City alone. People talked a lot. Sorry, it's having a hard time changing sometimes. See there, sorry about that. That it had 250,000 people on the CalGang database, and we didn't even know that at first, but we learned it later through a PRA, and that it was the fault of youth and families. And what they weren't talking about is that the fact that those numbers referred to alleged members, that there was a very broad criteria, and it was 100% in the hands of law enforcement, and was a very secret process that people couldn't challenge or even be notified about. And as well as that, even police officials, our sheriff, our LAPD chiefs regularly admitted that less than 5% of the people that were labeled as alleged gang members were even committing any acts of violence. It also didn't talk about the fact that LA was nationally and worldwide #1 in many things that were harmful to young people, and that probably contributed much more to violence in our minds, but that wasn't a part of the conversation, or the historical roots of LA's violence, and the failure of suppression to solve that violence over time. And so we started to try to change the themes around how this issue was being talked about. The first thing we did is we mapped what we were #1 in worldwide and nationwide. And you can see a list of things there, but some of the things are #1 worldwide in incarceration. We have the largest jail system, juvenile hall system, probation departments in the world, the largest state prison system, kind of competing with Texas, of which we're only 27% of the state's population, but 40% of the population that goes into the prison system. We were also #1 in the manufacturing of handguns in the Southern California region, #1 in white supremacy gangs, although not a single white supremacy group was on a gang injunction. We were importing and exporting all 5 illicit drugs. We're still the only port in the world that's the major importer and exporter of all 5. And we have the 3rd largest ports in the world, so that's significant. And nationwide, we had the largest gap between rich and poor, the largest population of people living without housing, of youth living on the streets. I put riots in quotes, but so-called riots, although when you looked at our history, all of those riots were either rebellions by the community to challenge police violence or the police attacking the community. So there were things that we thought were much more important in terms of discussing why we had violence in our county than putting all the onus on youth and families. What we started to see too, when we went all the way back in our history to the 1800s, that gang suppression policies, and they're very ancient in LA County, were always about taking land. And that suppression was directly connected to land ownership, land seizure, displacement, and later on, gentrification. So in the beginning, displacement through slavery of Native peoples here or extermination of Native peoples, and then later displacement through gentrification, redlining, sundown towns, the histories that exist throughout the country but aren't usually talked about as part of LA's history. And so if we looked at what happened in LA, our gang war started in 1848 with the illegal annexation of this part of the United States, the whole Southwest, through the illegal war with Mexico. And of course, the 13th Amendment also played a part, although I think it probably would have moved forward without that. And so by 1848, when Americans started to move into the region, they took all the land except for the very, very wealthiest of what were considered Californios. They took everyone else's land. And when people started to fight back, they were immediately labeled as bandits. And so from 1848 to 1871, LA County had the highest lynching rate of any region in the nation, largely of Mexicans, what were labeled as Mexicans, but again, considered themselves Californios that were struggling to reclaim their land, and were labeled as bandidos or bandits. And there were 3 kinds of hangings that happened, either illegal hangings, mob lynchings in the wilderness, or a deputized lynch mob that would hunt people down and lynch them, or hanging judges, circuit judges that would come through. In 1871, still to this day, we have the largest, the largest mass lynching in U.S. history, when Chinatown was burned to the ground. Again, gang labels were used as the excuse. There was a shootout between rival Tong factions in Chinatown, and a young woman was killed. And in addition to that happening, a man that was killed was a beloved chicken rancher in the area, a white man, kind of like, as you could say, LA's Colonel Sanders. And a mob of between 300 and 600 people, mostly white but also Latinos, descended on Chinatown, burned Chinatown to the ground. 18 men were lynched from the rafters and from other makeshift lynching systems that they had built during the mob. And then they also killed, depending on what news records that you look at, about 83 people died that night. Chinatown was burned to the ground. And when you come to LA, you'll see that we have a fake Chinatown to this day, built several miles to the northwest of where that happened, many decades later with movie sets. So our Chinatown really literally looks like fake movie sets stuck onto the building, to brick buildings. And there's other things that happened at that time too. We can't talk all about the Wuhan gangs, but it continued throughout the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Probably a lot of people have heard about the Zoot Suit riot, but was really more of a sailor riot when sailors on the ports during World War II came into the Latino Chicano communities and beat up young people. Only young people were arrested in that riot, and none of the sailors were held accountable. But if we go back, speed ahead to the 1960s and 70s, out of LA comes the beginnings of this backlash against youth power, all the youth power movements of the 60s. And three notable figures come out of LA County. We apologize to all of you for what we've exported to the rest of the world. Nixon was born and grew up here in LA County, first in Yorba Linda and then in Whittier. He rose to power here, political power. And as president, he's the first to declare the war on drugs. And then in his second term, the war on drugs, all the money that went to treatment, which was part of the money funded in the first term, was taken through law enforcement pushback, and it became fully a suppression model. He's also the person that kind of created this law and order backlash from the federal level all the way down to the local levels in terms of the militarization of police. Ronald Reagan wasn't born here, but had his whole professional, you could quote unquote professional career and political career here. He was governor at this time, and he started to implement those same policies at the state level here in California. And we start to see the largest buildup of the prison system of any region in the world outside of war, like the building of concentration camps. And then the third person is Howard Jarvis, and Howard Jarvis also came out of LA County. He's considered like the godfather of the anti-tax movement, very white, racist, regressive movement that started to pull money out of public systems, including Proposition 13, which he authored, passed by voters, decimated our tax structure around public schools and other public resources. So this is kind of the basis for how the war on gangs in a more modern era really came to have its infrastructure built. What you start to see first is the backlash against the 60s movement. So this is the 65 Watts Rebellion. That photo there is the first rebellion where Army tanks were used against civilian populations. Chief Parker, who was our LAPD chief at that time, was famous for so-called professionalizing LAPD because he put in a command structure and rooted out some of the monetary corruption, but also famously racist and hired not only an almost all-white force, but a force that was largely from the southeastern part of the United States. And so police killings and police beatings of people of color, especially Black men, really increased. And the Watts Rebellion, they used Army tanks and other military, as well as the National Guard itself, against the civilian population. You started to see the framing of political dissidents. This is Geronimo Pratt, George Jackson, the assassination of political leaders. This is George Jackson's funeral. He was assassinated in a California prison and was one of the people that jump-started the prison rights movement. People that were considered dissidents on campuses were really targeted here. This is Angela Davis. The Chicano moratorium led to the killing by the LA County Sheriff of a famous journalist, as well as 3 other people. And it later came out that in the killing of the journalist, Ruben Salazar, it was said that he died in the park, but he in fact died in a cafe. So all of this kind of gives us the context for the buildup of the more modern war on gangs. But the thing that's most essential is that what Reagan did is then worked with local law enforcement and federal law enforcement, FBI and CIA, to flood poor communities with drugs and guns. And of course, this was considered a conspiracy theory, but congressional hearings proved that this was in fact what happened. And especially for LA County, the congressional hearings really focused on LA. And what people say, the elders that were there at that time said that not only were the 60s leaders taken out, the 70s movements crushed, but you would go up to the train tracks and there'd be a boxcar. And when you opened the boxcar, there'd be just drugs and guns there. And this has now been well documented. Similarly, the policies of Reagan took out all of the manufacturing jobs and union jobs that were here in South Central Los Angeles and throughout the nation through globalization. And so you have this influx of drugs and guns and this outsourcing of union living wage jobs, and it creates a really debilitating drug economy here. And so out of LA at this time, all of these policies come out and quickly spread throughout the country. Most notably, I think, building on the 65 Wash Rebellion, the LAPD really started to militarize all of its operations, and this quickly spread to other law enforcement in the region. That included Gates, who wasn't even chief yet. He was under Parker, creating the first SWAT unit, the first gang unit, he called Crash Unit, which Crash stood for the last two letters in the acronym, Street Hoodlums. So even the names that were used, originally it was called Trash, Total Retaliation Against Street Hoodlums, but even that got too much pushback. But you could see that it was a very punitive system. And obviously, Gates is also known for creating DARE, which has since been shown to be not effective. And so what you start to see is that these policies lead to a mass incarceration of young people of color. And between the 80s and 2005, in California, we built 21 prisons. We've since built another, so that's 22 prisons. We started with 12, so we now have 32 state prisons and only 34 state universities. And during that time, we built 21 prisons. We only built 3 state universities. So in the 1980s, coming out of this, everyone knows about John DeLulio's claim that young people were going to be, particularly young people of color, a super predator generation. That's been disproven, but those policies, as everywhere, were used to expand even further LA County's war on gangs, and intensified it also to be not only something that was embedded into state law, but also embedded into police practice. So some of the things that happened was LA County was the first to create gang injunctions based on nuisance abatements. They first started in Pomona, West Covina, and LA in 82 and 83. And then we established CLEAR, which was the first use of joint court enforcement to go after quote unquote gangs. And then in 1987, the LA County Sheriff's Department created the first gang database and quickly started to share that database with other law enforcement, creating shared databases. And then finally in 88, local LA officials wrote the STEP Act, the Street Terrorism Enforcement and Prevention Act, which was the first act in the country and probably the world, we haven't found another one, that labeled gang members as quote unquote any group of 3 or more people acting together to commit a crime. Of course, Rampart detectives of LAPD weren't facing gang allegations in court or at gang enhancements. And, the Enron executives that stole money from people that were using public resources, utilities in California weren't labeled as gangs. So it was always a label that was used to go after young people of color. The way that for most people, getting out of the gang database also became incredibly easy. So law enforcement starts to fill out, and this continues to this day, what's called a FI card. Most people know it as a field interview card. Some departments call it a field information card. And that information has become more and more computerized. So now in the field, oftentimes it's a handheld computer, but many still use paper cards. And then that information is taken back to the station, and a gang officer determines whether or not, quote unquote, that person should be labeled as a gang member, associate, or affiliate. And they add that to a database. If that database is shared with other departments, it's most often also shared with the statewide database, CalGang, that was established by the STEP Act. The other thing that we found, so up until this time, remember that the first gang database was created in 1987, and by 2012, no one had ever known who was actually on the database. There had never been a Public Record Act request to expose who was on it. The Department of Justice wasn't monitoring it, although they were kind of loosely expected to do so. And there was a huge contract given to a website developer and a database developer to monitor it. So it was fully in the hands of law enforcement and corporations with no oversight. And so the Youth Justice Coalition put in the first public record act request. And in 2012, we released data that proved that there were 201,000, almost 202,000, but 201,94 people on the CalGang database, that the vast majority, 94, almost 95%, were male. And we were also able to prove the huge racial disparities. The other thing that we were able to prove was the community was saying that very young children were being put in the database, and law enforcement was denying that. But when we did that PRA, it exposed that young people on that specific day, we only got 1 day's data, what was happening, a snapshot on that day, that young people as young as 10 were on the database. We passed a series of laws I'll talk about, but I think what's most notable is just passing the first law, Senate Bill 458. By 4 years later, there were only 150,000 people on CalGang. So just a little bit of light shed on the system required that they look a lot at the problems that were happening. The other thing that we were able to expose is how loosely the criteria was enabling people to get on. And so all you had to do was meet 2 of 10 very broad general criteria to be labeled a gang member. And again, it could be labeled as a gang member, affiliate, or associate. Those are all listed there, but some of the things that are most crazy to us was that you were in a gang area, and we couldn't imagine any young person of color being seen frequenting gang areas. And of course, if white people were living in those communities, like I've always lived in communities of color ever since I was a child, and I've never been targeted or questioned the same way as my friends or classmates were that were of color about where was I from, who was I with, why was I in the area. But that was enough to meet one of the criteria. Being with other known gang members was another ability to get you on. So if you're with your family members, your brothers, your classmates, that was getting a lot of people on. And then another one that was crazy to us, many of these are crazy, but just to note some of them, that you could be identified as a gang member by an untested informant. They also had a criteria that you could be identified by a tested or a reliable informant, but also that an unreliable informant could get you on. And then if you were in custody, a county jail, juvenile hall, state prison, etc., just an in-custody interview for the purposes of security within the facility could get you onto the database, which for us was particularly troubling because people aren't given a choice if you go into county jail, especially if you're a young man. I've been locked up several times, and I was never asked this as a young woman, but as a young man, the first question you would ask is, who do you run with? And if you didn't make a decision for yourself, they would make a decision for you. So those in-custody interviews weren't reliable. The other thing that we were able to prove, or we were pushing, is that we were hearing from the community that gang databases were having huge impacts on people's lives. And law enforcement regularly said that this has no impact on how you're seeing beyond it being a surveillance tool. It's just a crime prevention tool for us. And when we're in the midst of a criminal investigation, then it's an investigatory tool. It doesn't impact people's lives. But people were saying, and people were, we were living next door to people and seeing that it was being used, we thought, as a way to exclude them from public housing, to deny them access to certain employment, particularly public employment, et cetera. And so we continued to push back in terms of those allegations that we had with law enforcement. And so the first thing we did was we passed a state law, Senate Bill 458 that I mentioned, that gave young people under the age of 18, we tried to get it for all ages, but that was the first bill. We weren't able to win that. So we were able to get people under the age of 18 and their parents the right to be notified if they were added to a shared database, the right to challenge it at the station level, and this right to challenge it in court. Although with the first bill, there was no requirement and no follow-up by the system to make those policies standard across the state or to have a real court process spelled out. So we saw a lot of different systems being used by different law enforcement departments, and many law enforcement departments that weren't responding to people's inquiries at all. So then we also pushed for additional legislation. The next thing we did is we went to the state audit. There's a joint legislative audit committee, and we asked them to audit the shared database, the CalGang database, the largest one, and the shared databases that feed into it, And this would have been the first time ever that the database was audited, or the Department of Justice really got seriously involved in looking into the database. The thing that was amazing too is they took all our questions. So the audit was exactly the questions we want answered. The only thing we asked for like a full, all the years that the database had been in place, going all the way back to, I think the statewide database was created in the early 90s. And then and some of those years were cut off. But otherwise, we got a really substantive audit over many, many years. And the audit proved what the community had long claimed, that there was corrupt data, that there was a misuse of criteria leading to inaccuracy in terms of who was labeled, and that there was no guarantee of exit. Some people on the database didn't have purge dates until after they would be dead, whereas you're supposed to have a purge date every 5 years without police contact. In terms of corrupt data, one of the things we found that was most crazy was that there was 42 people that had supposedly been put on the database under the age of 1. Either the data was so corrupt or they were under the age of 1 when they were put on. And 28 of them were self-admitted gang members. So that was crazy to see. And it also proved everything the community was saying. The audit proved that it was being used illegally to deny people access to the military, to deny people access to public buildings. Like we had one member that was invited to go to the White House to meet President Obama and was denied based on his name being on the database. And he was put on that database when he was 11, or he thinks so, because that's the most, given the stops, that's the one that seems to make the most sense. And so we exposed a lot with the audit. That audit also enabled us to push for the passing of a bill, Assembly Bill 2298. And in 2016, it was passed, and it expanded those protections, right to notification, right to challenge, and then right to challenge at the court level to all age groups, not just to people under the age of 18. And it also required a standard format across the state for all law enforcement to follow. And we worked with Judicial Council to create an actual court form so that when people get to the place where if they're denied their name being removed at the agency level, then because you're going to the same agency who put you on, you can also go to civil court. And it's a very simple form. We tried to make all these processes as simple as possible so that you didn't have to be a lawyer to do them or to engage in them. We wanted to make it very accessible to community. And you have all those forms that you can use that got sent out. And then finally in 2017, we also co-sponsored Assembly Bill 90, and that moved oversight of the gang database to the Department of Justice. It blocked federal access to shared gang databases for the purposes of immigration enforcement. And we did that. We also were able to prove with the audit that the database was being used to fast track people for deportation. In the United States, you can be deported based on gang allegations without even having an arrest. And it also created a technical advisory committee, which included half community representation. We have 2 people on there that are directly impacted. One, a person who has been a gang intervention worker for decades, and another, a person who's been labeled. Both of them have been labeled and had huge consequences because of their gang label. And then we have an immigrant rights expert on the panel, and as well a human and civil rights expert. And all but one of our nominees got put onto that shared database. So that was also after passing a law. We had a little mini campaign to get people appointed. Ever since then, the YJCs, since our beginning too, we've also challenged injunctions. And gang injunctions are, I'm sorry, I'm like spitting so much information at you, but gang injunctions are public areas. You could think of it like a restraining order that's taken out against a group of individuals as opposed to just a single individual. And it means that people are subject to criminal sanctions without having done criminal acts. It builds on the history of nuisance abatements. So the first one, again, was put in place in 1982 in West Covina, and it was against a single house that was seen as a drug house. But quickly, they were expanded to be over entire groups of people and in much larger regions, and to go what they labeled the geographic area as quote unquote a safety zone. Some of those safety zones now are huge. So we now have, just in LA City alone, we had 49 injunctions covering 82 neighborhoods. And the largest ones was like the entire city of Laverne, for example, in LA County, the entire city of Inglewood in LA County. And then for LA City injunctions, the largest one was the entire city of San Fernando. So you could really be living in an injunction zone and not be able to leave it as someone who is named. And if you were named on that injunction, you were subject to arrest and even jailing for up to 6 months. if you were violating the injunction in any way. So many of them said you couldn't carry a beeper or a cell phone. You couldn't be on the sidewalk or loitering without facing that kind of violation. You couldn't climb trees in some injunctions because it was assumed you were climbing trees to be a lookout. The most notable thing that they went after in every injunction was an association clause, which said that you couldn't associate with any other quote unquote known gang members. Known gang members meaning anyone who's been labeled that by police, either on a database locally or a shared database. And so it meant that people were consistently violated for being at a birthday party or a repast or a baby shower, or standing at the bus stop going to and from work or school, or being at a place of employment, even if it was in the injunction zone. The only things that were carved out were if you were enrolled in school, and you were actually in the school, not an after-school program, but the school itself, or a church service. So there was a raid of a church program in the basement of a church, actually, and was not considered a service. And I mentioned this also earlier, but huge racial disparities. You can see the racial disparities on the infographics there in terms of who was targeted, and the fact we had, we were kind of the epicenter for methamphetamine production here in LA County, Orange County, Riverside County, yet not a single white biker gang was targeted for a gang injunction. White supremacy groups being, larger here, not a single white supremacy group targeted for a gang injunction. There was a couple of surfer crews that were bullying people for waves, and they were considered for injunctions, but even they never actually got an injunction. So we fought injunctions. For 18th Street was our first one we fought. We lost, but we learned a lot. We tried to stop injunctions from being put into place because it's very difficult for people without legal protection, because it's a civil court order. You can't fight. You don't get guaranteed legal defense in fighting it. So most people don't even know they can fight it. If you're served correctly, which many people aren't, you get this huge stack of papers, and you don't know how to respond to it, and then you have to respond without a lawyer or pay for a lawyer. And so we tried to go into court and just squash injunctions, not just based on individuals fighting, but on challenging the whole need for an injunction. And one of the things we found from the very beginning, even looking at where injunctions were originally put in place, West Covina, Pomona, the first LA City injunction was against the Playboy Gangster Crips, which is the neighborhood closest to Beverly Hills and Culver City, which are incredibly wealthy white areas, was that injunctions were not put in place where the areas were facing the greatest level of violence, but were put in place in areas that were either where people of color were moving into a traditionally white area, or where white people were moving in and displacing or gentrifying a traditionally community of color. And so in the earlier injunctions, it was around white people being afraid of people in color coming into school districts or into homes. And then in the later injunctions, more recent injunctions, for sure a tool of displacement gentrification. So Echo Park, Venice, all the neighborhoods around USC, University of Southern California. We can go, again and again, there's just dozens and dozens of neighborhoods where they got their injunctions when people were being displaced through massive gentrification and economic development. Imperial Courts was our first success. We were able to win against an injunction being put in place there in Watts. All the other large public housing projects, Jordan Downs and Nickerson Gardens, have injunctions. We created, as part of that process with Imperial Court, the nation's first exit process, but we also, it was not the process we wanted, and it was a very fake process. So we also started to show how the city attorney's office wasn't taking anybody off, even though they had this process to supposedly give people a fair shot at challenging their service. And then in the Echo Park injunction, again, we didn't win that injunction, but we put so much pressure on the city attorney that we were able to really squash the service of people. And from what our knowledge and talking to people in the community, only 4 people were served, despite the fact it covered like 6 neighborhoods. And then we had a few other injunctions we fought, but most recently, just last month, we won a decision in court. We sued the city attorney on injunctions in a case called Youth Justice Coalition versus the City of LA. It also had named plaintiffs in the case. And ACLU, as well as a number of other attorneys here in LA, were lead counsel for us on the case. And we were able to basically get a ruling from the court that gang injunctions are in fact unconstitutional, because it constitutes unequal protection under the law for people that are labeled by something no other than police surveillance. And so by taking away people's rights to movement, rights to association, you're basically setting up two different legal systems for people based on racial profiling. And so that case, we already, in terms of the mediation with the city attorney's office over the case before it even was heard by the judge, in July, about 7,000 people were removed from the city's gang injunctions. And now with the case, all but a very few people have been taken off gang injunctions. And if the city only option now is to either appeal to the state Supreme Court, which we hope they won't do, or to reserve everyone or to reserve new people to rebuild all those injunctions, which given our history with Echo Park, we don't think they'll do. They're incredibly costly and we don't think they're effective. And many people have asked us, like, why not allow gang injunctions to be put in place? And what we found, much like gang databases, is that you isolate people from resources in the community when they can't be on public transportation, when they can't visit their own children, when they can't access job training programs or after-school programs or other resources because an association could get them violated. Or when you actually arrest them for association, usually, and they lose access to federal financial aid or local grants because they're not in college, missing a few days of college, they're out, or because missing, when you're cycling in and out of jail because of gang injunction violations, an employer might believe you the first time, maybe the second time, but eventually people lose their employment. So for all those reasons, we think they really destabilize people and drive them further into the underground economy. We don't think it at this point. We've really been able to prove it. And I think most notably, similarly to the gang database, it's also been used to evict people and their entire families from public housing. So it also drives the violence into other neighborhoods. So for people that maybe are engaged in the violence, when a gang injunction is put in place, we've also been able to chart that, where the violence then moves, the drug trafficking moves to an area right next door that doesn't have a gang injunction. And meanwhile, the people that are trapped and are left are even more cut off from resources and services. So we also eventually hope to end gang enhancements. Gang enhancements are, you can get up to 10 years more for your cases for each case in court. So for example, if you were with someone who shot somebody, I'll give you a real life example. We worked on a case with one of our members, Sammy Padilla. Sammy was 14 and he was walking with his friend, and they don't deny that they weren't from a neighborhood. We don't call them gangs, just coalition. We try not, we don't want to build into that criminal label, but they are neighborhoods. And so he was walking with people from his neighborhood, and one of the people that he was with took out a gun and shot at some other young people across the street, and unfortunately killed one of the people across the street. Because there was 4 people across the street, everyone that was in Sammy's group, not just the shooter, were charged similarly for 3 attempted murder and 1 murder. And then they got 25 to life for each of the murders and attempts. They got 25 to life for each of the gun enhancements, and they got 10 years added for each of the gang enhancements, so an extra 40 years for the gang enhancements. And so in Sammy's case, when we first went to court with him, he was looking at over 211 years to life. A young man, 14, who was not the shooter, not accused of being the shooter, and didn't have any serious convictions. I think he had a weed possession. It was the only conviction he had prior to this. And even with all the court advocacy and packing the court and media, the best we could get under California law was about 111 to life. Since then we've worked with other groups in California to change sentencing laws, but Sammy will still have to serve 25 to life before he has the opportunity at parole, even with those sentencing changes. So last year we co-sponsored the first bill that looked at enhancements. It looked at gun enhancements, and it did a very small thing, and it was still very tough to get passed. But Senate Bill 620 moved judicial gun enhancements back under judicial discretion, so that gun enhancements were not at the discretion of the judge. If the prosecutors brought a gun enhancement, then if you were convicted, you would get that gun enhancement. So for many people, enhancements are longer than their controlling offense, the term for their controlling offense. So the last thing I just want to touch on real briefly, what we've been trying to work on too, is a justice reinvestment strategy, saying that rather than creating gang injunctions, we should be really creating youth empowerment zones, youth opportunity zones, and divert funds away from suppression and our addiction to policing and incarceration as our only public safety strategy. So we've engaged in a process to really monitor what the system costs us locally and in our state. And we looked at, for example, prison spending, how it went from being #1 in school spending, California, and then with the buildup of the prison system behind all of these policies, we're now #1 in prison spending nationwide and worldwide. And depending on the year's budget, between 41 and 47 in K through 12 spending. And right now we're number 51 in higher ed spending. So you can see this direct correlation, just if you look at education and incarceration in terms of what the war on gangs has cost us. It's largely war on gangs here. I would say probably even more impactful in our area than the war on drugs, although that's very significant also. And then if you look at how it's impacted other things, we've also lost our funding for parks, playgrounds, youth jobs, intervention workers, et cetera. So we've had a campaign here to just divert 5% of local law enforcement money, which would give us $236 million a year for young people, including putting 1,000 peace builders in streets and in schools, as New York did way back in 1955. So that's the end, and I'll just open it up for folks if they want to ask questions.
Hey, thanks so much, Kim. That was great, and I just want to point out to people a couple of things. One, some of these resources you can find in the handout section for the webinar. So, for example, Kim's PowerPoint and some other resources that she's shared with us. In addition, I think there were some other resources Kim had that we weren't able to post because of limitations on the number of documents we can post, but we can send that out to you after. And then finally, there's a great, and maybe you could talk about this a little, Kim, YouTube video of a flash mob associated with Youth Justice Coalition of young people that were coming out to kind of take back their streets. So we aren't able to show it, unfortunately. We just weren't able to get the audio to work, but you'll find it in the resources. And Kim, can you just say a little about what that is?
Sure. So a lot of what the Youth Justice Coalition has engaged in is direct action led by young people on these issues. So in addition to going to every public hearing and putting out reports and research on the impact of the war on gangs, we've also done creative direct action, whether it's in the streets, in the community to educate the larger community, or whether it's targeting the officials that are responsible for these policies. And one example of that, we wanted to put a lot of pressure on City Attorney Mike Fuhrer around the Echo Park injunction. And so young people who were not dancers, when you look at the video, we look pretty funny, but we created a flash mob around the Thriller, Michael Jackson's Thriller. It was inspired. There's an amazing video that you should it's pretty easy to find, that happened in the Philippines in a prison where all the people that were locked up there created a massive showing of Thriller, and they're much better. They're like really exceptional. So we used that as an inspiration, and we got a huge sound system and took over an intersection in the Echo Park injunction that was at the heart of where the injunction zone was. Blocked the intersection for many minutes. The police came out. You could hear at the very end the helicopters are ordering people to disperse. And I think at that exact same moment that they order him to disperse, you hear Vincent Price laughing. So it's kind of crazy that would happen at the exact same time. But that was like one example of many creative actions that young people have been engaged in.
That's great. So I have a couple questions, and then if folks want to ask questions, there's two ways you can do it. Just type it into the question box, or alternatively, you should see a way to click on the button to raise your hand, and then I can unmute you if you would like to ask the question yourself. So I have a question from Josh Rovner, and he says, which parts of the legislative pushback against gang databases got the most support from conservative members?
None of them. We had huge law enforcement opposition. We've worked on a lot of bills around sentencing, including ending life without parole through 2 bills, and it took about 6 years past the first bill. And then also expanding those protections to young people who got virtual life sentences or extreme sentences. So all the way up to age 24 now, people have an opportunity for a lower parole hearing. We've worked on bills around police violence. We were co-sponsors on a bill to look at racial identity profiling, and none of those bills got as much law enforcement pushback as the gang database bills did. I think the only thing I've seen to compare is the pushback from the bail bonds industry and bounty hunters to the efforts now to reform bail in California. But that's even bail bonds, not actual law enforcement. But when the gang databases went up, especially when Assembly Bill 2298 went up, there was a line of about 15 or 20 different law enforcement agencies, which doesn't sound like a lot. But in our legislature, it's pretty rare that you see law enforcement come out to hearings. You'll usually just see their paid lobbyists, and there'll be 2 or 3 lined up to oppose your bill, as well as someone to testify in opposition to your bill. In addition, we had a lot of pushback on amendments. We had to push very hard against their amendments. The last year with AB 90, they also put in their own, I would say, fake version of our bill, watered down version of our bill, tried to move their own bill, and that was with the police chiefs. So the main opposition for us has been the Police Chiefs Association, the DA's Association, the Sheriff's Association, and then there's lobbyists that handle like all the other small departments. There's over 500 law enforcement agencies in California, over 57 law enforcement agencies in LA County alone, and they also contribute some of the highest levels of funds to elected officials, so they're incredibly powerful. The only law enforcement that stayed off of the bills was the CCPOA, which is the Prison Guards Union, because, sorry about that sound, because it impacted them in terms of these in-custody interviews, but they actually, we got them to stay off of the bill. But other than that, all law enforcement was opposed.
Wow. Josh also wanted to know, what was the fake reform bill pushed by law enforcement?
It was a bill by Senator Mendoza, and I can't remember the number for it now, but I think it was 505. But don't quote me on that, and I'll find out and I'll find that out. Or you can also, anyone can contact me. The easiest way to reach me always is by text. So if you text me any of your questions or anything you want sent to you directly, you can just text me with your question or your request and your any identifying, like if you want to give me your email address. And my cell phone number is 323-327-1259.
Great, thanks, Kim. Okay, I have another question, which is, did the request for review of denial of request to remove name from gang database result from legislation or lawsuit?
The database results from legislation. The gang injunction changes is largely from lawsuits. There's a very notable case in Orange County. I encourage everybody to look up, a Vasquez decision that was also led by the Orange County ACLU. And that was the first to say that people had to have opportunities for an active participation hearing before they could be subject to a gang injunction. And that was really the basis for the lawsuit that was brought in LA City, sorry. And then the LA City, the case was brought by the ACLU here in LA City or Southern California, as well as Urban Peace Institute, which is another agency here in LA that works on gang suppression issues, as well as works to train gang intervention workers. And then there was a private firm too. So 3 different agencies, law firms that worked on that case. And so I can send you both the decision in our case as well as, link you to the Vasquez decision. And there's been other challenges across the state through time in California, but most have been fairly unsuccessful until Vasquez. So Vasquez, while there were other important decisions, there's also been a lot of the courts maintaining that gang injunctions were constitutional.
Okay. I had a question going back to your fight for some of these bills and the strong, challenges by the police and sheriff's association. What was kind of like the biggest factor that enabled you to overcome, that kind of strong opposition?
Well, it was really essential that the first bill, Senate Bill 458, we were the only sponsors and we were kind of going it alone. And we were also super rookies in Sacramento. We still are. We're still really learning so much, but we were super, super new to it then. But by the second bill, Assembly Bill 2298, had several co-sponsors, really great co-sponsors, like the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights in Los Angeles is a very strong immigrant rights organization. They're known nationally. The Urban Peace Institute that I mentioned was on that second bill. The Policy Link, which was kind of a nationally known policy organization, really added incredible strength to that second bill. And so as opposition to the bills grew, we also had much stronger backup or sponsorship by organizations. But I think what's really, really key is that we built, and when I say we, I don't just mean us, the National Immigrant Law Center was really impactful in helping on this, as well as a number of grassroots organizations built a statewide coalition that we still meet every month. And that coalition, when it first came together, was to pass Assembly Bill 2298. And that coalition stayed together to pass Assembly Bill 90. And most recently, last summer, when the coalition came together, we talked about what its long-term goals would be. And there was a little bit of a debate, should we just be working on dismantling or challenging or monitoring gang databases, or should we be trying to look at the whole war on gangs and it's as an apparatus that includes gang databases, injunctions, gang enhancements, and immigration. And people overwhelmingly decided to go after the whole apparatus, the whole war on gangs. So now that coalition is working on all aspects. And it's not that people weren't working on these issues before, but we were working on them locally in our own cities and counties, within our own organizations, in our own court challenges. And that coalition now links people across the state. And anybody from California or from outside of California who wants to join that coalition is open, and we welcome everyone who wants to get involved in these issues.
Great, thank you, Kim. And we're getting close to the end. I just wanted to make sure, I know there were two young people that work with you that were going to say a few things, but they ended up having another meeting, so I just want to make sure that
they're stuck. They're stuck in a meeting. We're trying to pass a Bill of Rights for families after use of force homicides. So they're here in that meeting with the Sheriff's Oversight Commissioners.
Okay.
Sorry about that. They would have been way better.
Yeah, no, I just didn't want to not hear from them if they were there. So
I'm actually glad you brought that up, though, because in terms of the strength of what passed the bills, it was the families and young people that not only were the head of these court challenges, the head of the direct action with all the gang injunctions, and also traveled to Sacramento. Some people traveled almost weekly from March through September of every year. We've had a bill and have testified before the state legislators at great risk to themselves, too, talking in some cases about people that have gang labels have been used to indict them, and they've been sitting in jail for months at some years while they've been fighting a case based solely on their gang label that has put really serious charges on them, or young people that have been undocumented, others that have been undocumented and face deportation, testifying in front of law enforcement, or family members whose own children. In the case of the first bill, we took families whose children had been killed because they didn't know about their own child's involvement in the system. They argued very effectively that if a parent doesn't know what their child's doing, if a law enforcement officer is putting them on a secret file and not even notifying family members, then what does that really mean for the young person's safety? So I just want to highlight that the real heroes of all of this work are the families and the people labeled impacted by gang allegations that have led this work.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Kim. I think we're at the end here, but I really appreciate your presentation, and I appreciate everybody that signed in. I think that we all learned a lot, and I appreciate the resources. I hope folks will take note of